Welcome, and thank you for joining us in our ongoing series of translating evidence in practice. Today, focusing on optimizing nutritional content of enteral nutrition for preterm infants. I welcome you on behalf of our senior editorial team, including myself, Bill McGuire, Colleen Ovalman, and Claire LaFrance, as well as senior editors Jeff Horbar, Prakash Shah, Suresh Gotham, Jackie Ho, and David Osborne, and our associate editorial team. Today, we'll be joined by two guest discussants, both experts in the field. Bill McGuire, our coordinating editor, but also senior author on many of the reviews I'll be discussing today, and Brenda Poindexter, professor at the Emory University School of Medicine and chief of neonatology at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. This series is sponsored by the Vermont-Oxford Network and a grant from the section on neonatal perinatal medicine from the Academy of Pediatrics, as well as support from the Gerber Foundation. As a matter of disclosure, I am the vice president of Vermont-Oxford Network and coordinating editor of Cochrane Neonatal, the work of which I'll be presenting to you this afternoon. The purpose of this series is to develop an understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of evidence provided by systematic reviews and meta-analyses that inform our practice in neonatal perinatal medicine. And specifically, for today's sessions, we'll be focusing on how we optimize nutrition through supplementation and fortification. In the first seminar in this series, I pointed out to you a wonderful review article from William Hay regarding the strategies for feeding the preterm infant. And just to set the context of how important this is, I'd like to point out things that are probably obvious to you all. As a greater number of small, immature babies survive, caregivers have been called on to develop more effective nutritional strategies, including optimizing breastfeeding, developing newer formulas, and the focus of today's discussion, supplementing enteral feeds. Much of what I'll be presenting to you today will deal with growth parameters, which may feel a little dry and sometimes lack obvious clinical meaning. But we do know that we have accepted in general the recommendation that growth is an important outcome and that postnatal growth should be the same as normal growth for the fetus. This is a debatable point, but it is a generally accepted target for our goals. And frankly, it proves to be a challenge. Reports from NICUs across the world demonstrate that we have considerable room for improvement. The growth of nearly all preterm infants during their hospitalization in intensive care, particularly our most immature infants, lags far behind the fetal growth curves in the third trimester. Just taking a look at data from the Vermont-Oxford database, 31% of very low birth weight infants have extreme growth failure, defined as being less than the third percentile on the Fenton growth charts. However, this failure in sustaining adequate growth varies between centers, some centers having a rate as low as 20% or less, but a quarter of the centers having growth failure in 40% or more of their infants. There's a great deal of variation in feeding practices. In the survey from Klingenberg and colleagues, one of the issues they brought up was the issue of using human milk fortifier, which in the UK is used in only 69% of the units, but is universally used in Canadian units. So what are the downstream effects of undernutrition and growth failure? Well, numerous studies have shown that failure to meet the preterm infant's nutritional goals at critical stages of development can produce serious problems, including short stature, growth failure, and most importantly, abnormalities of brain growth and development. So today, we're going to look at some of the key gaps in knowledge and focus on optimizing nutritional content of feeds. So let's dig into it. What do we know from trials? Well, to begin this session, I'm going to just present you with the facts from the meta-analyses of a variety of interventions aimed at improving supplementation and fortification of nutrition. We'll look at protein supplementation, lipid supplementation, multi-nutrient fortification, as well as the timing of fortification and unique strategies that look at how we can perhaps individualize the nutritional needs of our infants via fortification. And let's start with the reviews that deal with protein. Here's a review from Gao and colleagues looking at the comparison of different protein concentrations of human milk fortifier for promoting growth and neurodevelopment in preterm infants. As a matter of background, we know that human milk alone may provide inadequate amounts of protein to meet the growth requirements of preterm infants, in part because of the restrictions in the amounts of fluids they can tolerate. And it's become common practice to feed preterm infants with breast milk fortified with protein. They sought in this review to compare different protein concentrations in human milk fortifiers, and they looked at all published and unpublished randomized, quasi-randomized, and cluster trials looking at two different concentrations of proteins. Now, it's always a little difficult when we set cut points for what in fact are low concentrations or high concentrations, but for the purposes of this review, low protein diets were considered as those having less than 1 gram of protein per 100 mLs of expressed breast milk, moderate between 1 and 1.4 grams of proteins per 100 mLs, and high those that had greater than or equal to 1.4 grams of proteins per 100 mLs. So what we found are 9 trials that discuss this issue of protein concentration. And although that seems like a large-ish number of trials, I point out to you that it's actually a relatively small number of infants, 861 infants enrolled in these trials. The trials were mostly conducted in infants less than 32 weeks gestational age or less than 1,500 grams. All used a fortifier derived from bovine milk. 2 trials fed infants exclusively with mother's own milk. 3 gave supplementary feeds with donor human milk, and 4 supplemented with preterm infant formula. And as I noted, the trials were generally small, but not at high risk of bias. So here's a table looking at the growth parameters that are reported in these studies. The top of the table showing you the high versus moderate protein concentration studies, and the lower showing the moderate versus low protein concentration studies. Again, few infants enrolled in the trials. Now, it's hard to know what constitutes an important difference in weight gain, linear growth, or head circumference. And I won't repeat this each time we look at this data, but I don't know, at least in my mind, if I could say, oh, that much increase. For example, in this case, a weight gain, a mean difference of 0.66 grams per kilo per day. How meaningful is that ultimately? Except to tell you that there was more predictable weight gain in these groups. And in this case, for example, weight gain was improved in the high versus moderate protein concentration studies, but linear growth and head circumference were not. In comparing the moderate versus low protein concentrations, there were fewer studies, but there were actually greater improvements reported, both in weight gain and improvements in linear growth and head circumference. The authors concluded that feeding preterm infants with human milk fortifier containing high amounts of protein, compared with a fortifier containing moderate protein concentrations, resulted in a small increase in weight gain during the hospital stay. There may also be small increases in weight and length gain when infants are fed a fortifier containing moderate versus low protein concentration. The certainty of the evidence was very low to moderate, and results may change with the findings of ongoing studies, particularly when you look at the small sample sizes involved. There was insufficient evidence to assess the impact of protein concentration on the more meaningful longer-term outcomes, such as neurodevelopment, and further trials were clearly indicated as to whether modest increases in weight gain are associated with benefits or harms to long-term growth and neurodevelopment. So let's take a look at another review looking at protein fortification. And this is higher versus lower protein intake in formula-fed low birth weight infants. Again, it's unclear whether or not the amount of protein that is necessary to achieve sufficient growth, what that might be. And again, they looked at cut points slightly different than the previous study, looking at higher, 3 grams per kilo per day versus lower, less than 3 grams per kilo per day, protein intake during the initial hospital stay of formula-fed preterm infants or low birth weight infants to see what happened to growth and developmental outcomes. They defined, again, low protein intake as less than 3 grams per kilo per day and high as greater, but they also created a group of very high protein intake, infants who received greater than 4 grams per kilo per day, and presented on this. They identified 6 trials involving 218 infants. 5 of these studies compared low, less than 3 grams per kilo per day, versus high, 3 to 4 grams per kilo per day of protein intake. The trials were small, only 139 infants, and almost all had methodological limitations, and therefore there's a great deal of uncertainty, particularly when it regards to attrition. One of the studies compared high, 3 to 4 grams per kilo per day, versus very high, greater than 4 grams per kilo per day protein. Here again, looking at a table, we can see that in the studies that compared low to high protein intake, there was improved weight gain in the infants who received higher protein, as well as improved head circumference growth. For the one study that reported on very high protein intake, there was not a significant difference noted in weight gain or linear growth. The authors concluded that higher protein intakes accelerated weight gain, but limited information is available regarding the impact of higher formula protein intake on long-term outcomes such as development, and that research was needed to investigate the safety and efficacy of very high protein intake, which can be associated with uremia in these infants. So let's move on to take a look at the studies that report on supplementation or fortification with various fats. Here, Peretta and colleagues looked at high versus low medium chain triglyceride content of formula promoting short-term growth in preterm infants. Again, they note that growth in preterm infants can be challenging and that these preterm infants have very high nutrient requirements. To improve growth, fat may be added to preterm formula, either in the form of medium chain triglycerides, MCT oil, or long chain triglycerides. Medium chain triglycerides are easily accessible to the preterm infant with an immature digestive system, while long chain triglycerides are beneficial for CNS development and visual function. Both have been incorporated into preterm formulas in various amounts, but the effect on short-term growth and development is unclear. They took a look at randomized and quasi-randomized studies that compared low MCT formulas to higher MCT formulas. High MCT formulas were defined as 30% or more by weight, and low MCT formulas as less than 30% by weight. For inclusion, the infants had to be on full enteral diets, and the allocated formula must be the predominant source of nutrition. As is common with these nutritional studies, we identified a fair number of studies that involved relatively few infants. 10 trials were identified for this meta-analysis, including 253 infants. Here, looking at the forest plots of mean difference, we can see that the meta-analysis of weight gain velocity, grams per kilo per day, yielded a non-significant mean difference of minus 0.21 grams per kilo per day. And we can see that for weight gain, though only one study reporting on that is grams per day, yielded a very imprecise estimate of weight gain with a point estimate of 0 and the possibility of as much as a 6 gram per day increase or decrease in weight. In these studies, length gain showed a non-significant mean difference as well, as did changes in head circumference. Few studies and relatively imprecise estimates that did not show any benefit. The authors conclude that there is no evidence of difference between MCT and LCT on short-term growth, and therefore neither formula type could be conclusively shown to improve short-term growth and have fewer adverse effects. Further studies are necessary both to determine the effect on growth, but importantly, to determine other developmental outcomes and even short-term outcomes such as neck. Now, here's an interesting series of studies looking at long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acid supplementation in preterm infants. And this is particularly interesting because our efforts to supplement these long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids probably reflect issues beyond just growth, but also specific issues of neurodevelopment. The authors sought to assess the safety and benefits of formula milk supplemented with long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acid in preterm infants. They looked at the effect on visual function, development, and growth of these preterm infants. They included randomized controlled trials of enterally fed preterm infants. There's a lot of data on this issue, 17 trials involving over 2,000 infants. And so really this is one of the first areas in this general idea of supplementation, which is truly well researched in terms of the number and precision. Let's break it down into those domains the authors wanted to discuss. First, looking at physical growth. The meta-analysis of 5 studies that reported on physical growth showed an increase in weight and length at 2 months post-term in supplemented infants. The mean difference was small, 0.21, but statistically significant, as was their small difference in length, 0.47. However, these changes are not reflected when these infants are followed further down line. Meta-analysis of 4 studies at a corrected age of 12 months showed no significant effects on supplementation on growth outcomes. And there was no significant effect of long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids on weight, length, or head circumference in 2 studies when they followed infants out to 18 months. Visual acuity has been an area of interest when it comes to looking at long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids. Frequently, it was measured by Teller or Lea acuity cards in 8 studies, visual evoked potentials in 6 studies, and electroretinogram in 2 studies. Most studies found no significant differences in visual acuity between the supplemented infants and the control infants. But the data and the outcomes are so different that it's really not possible to synthesize this data and give you anything but that narrative report. In terms of neurodevelopment, 3 of the 7 studies reported some benefit on neurodevelopment. But when we look at the meta-analysis, we don't really see that necessarily bear up. In a meta-analysis of 4 studies evaluating Bayley scales of infant development at 12 months, there was no significant benefit to supplementation regarding the MDI or the PDI, demonstrated in these 2 figures here. The authors concluded that the enrolled trials were of relatively mature and healthy preterm infants, and that the assessment schedule and methodology, dose, and source of supplementation varied greatly. When they tried to pool these results, there was no clear long-term benefit or harm demonstrated by infants receiving LC-PUFA supplemented formulas. Of some note, though, there are studies that are not included in this that have begun to look at other important outcomes, such as chronic lung disease, and we await synthesis of that data to fully understand the impact of long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids. So let's move on to discuss general aspects of nutrition. So this is not thinking about one specific intervention such as fat or protein, but multi-nutrient fortification of human milk. The objectives of this study were to determine whether multi-nutrient fortified human milk compared with unfortified milk affects in clinically important outcomes, including growth and neurodevelopment, as well as adverse effects such as feeding intolerance or necrotizing enterocolitis. Again, randomized and quasi-randomized trials were included in this analysis. 18 studies were identified involving 1,456 infants. Here, looking at the forest plots, we can see that there was a profound effect on in-hospital weight gain when we look at all trials. Meta-analysis provided low to moderate certainty evidence showing that multi-nutrient fortification of human milk increased the in-hospital rate of weight gain with a mean difference of 1.76 grams per kilo per day. Looking here at subgroups, on top, the trials that recruited only very preterm infants or VLBW infants. Here in the middle, trials conducted in lower middle income countries. And lastly, trials using preterm formula powder as a fortifier, we see that in all of these subgroups, improved in-hospital weight gain was reported. Meta-analysis also provided low to moderate certainty evidence showing that multi-nutrient fortification of human milk increased in-hospital rate of body length with a mean difference of 0.11 centimeters per week. And lastly, there is evidence from the meta-analysis showing that multi-nutrient fortification of human milk increased in-hospital rate of head circumference to 0.06 centimeters per week. The data do not suggest other benefits or harms and provide low certainty evidence suggesting effects of multi-nutrient fortification on the risk of necrotizing enterocolitis, shown here, with a typical relative risk of 1.37, but a confidence interval that is broad and imprecise and could be compatible with either benefit or harm. The authors conclude that feeding preterm infants with multi-nutrient fortified human breast milk compared with unfortified human breast milk is associated with modest increases in in-hospital growth rates, but that the evidence is insufficient to show whether or not there are any important clinical effects, either on long-term growth or neurodevelopment. Let's take a look at some other more complex methods of fortification. Here, looking at human milk-derived fortifier versus bovine milk-derived fortifier. The objectives here were to take a look at whether fortification of breast milk feeds with human milk-derived fortifier in preterm infants reduces morbidity, mortality, and promotes growth. And again, randomized and quasi-randomized trials are included. Not much evidence here to go by. Really only one high-order randomized controlled trial involving just 127 infants. This table shows us the relative risk and risk differences for a few of the more important clinical outcomes reported in this one trial. There was no difference reported in feeding interruptions, necrotizing enterocolitis, late onset sepsis, retinopathy, BPD, or death. The authors appropriately conclude that this evidence is insufficient in evaluating human milk-derived fortifier compared to bovine milk-derived fortifier. The timing of fortification, of course, is one of the decisions that we face, and here a review of early fortification of human milk versus late fortification to promote growth in preterm infants. It's unclear when we should begin fortification of these infants in terms of optimizing growth, but decreasing the possible risks of necrotizing enterocolitis. Only 2 trials involving 237 infants are included in this analysis. All participants were very low birth weight infants. Early fortification was started when volumes of 20 milliliters per kilo per day were achieved, compared to later fortification, which was started when 100 milliliters per kilogram per day of feeds were achieved. One study used a bovine milk-based fortifier and the other a human fortifier. This table shows us both the outcomes regarding growth parameters and clinical outcomes, and there are no important effects that are seen based on earlier or later fortification, either on the immediate measures of growth, linear growth, head circumference, or time to regain birth weight, or in any of the important clinical outcomes, including time to reach full enteral feeds, necrotizing enterocolitis, duration of hospital stay, or mortality. Clearly, the evidence is insufficient to support or refute whether or not the practice of early fortification leads to meaningful clinical outcome measures. Perhaps the most intriguing approach is whether or not we can individualize the diet of infants in order to optimize their growth. And this review from Fabrizio and colleagues addresses that issue. They sought to determine whether individualizing fortification of breast milk in response to infants' blood urea nitrogen, which they defined as adjustable fortification, or to breast milk macronutrient content as measured with a milk analyzer, which they described as targeted fortification, whether that reduces morbidity and mortality in preterm infants. Interestingly, there are a fair number of trials, but very few infants, perhaps pointing out how difficult this approach really is. 7 trials involving 521 infants are reported. And whether or not you use the adjustable approach or whether you use the targeted approach, there are changes that are reported in early growth parameters, including weight gain, linear growth, and head circumference. There are no meaningful downstream effects in terms of clinical outcomes, including bronchopulmonary dysplasia, necrotizing enterocolitis, or retinopathy of prematurity. The authors concluded that moderate to low certainty evidence suggested that individualized, whether it was targeted or adjustable, fortification of enteral feeds increases growth velocity, as defined as increases in weight gain, length, and head circumference, but that there were no clinical outcomes and there was great uncertainty regarding the safety and benefit long term. That's a lot of information from the trials. A lot of information, particularly telling us about how we might optimize growth, but a huge paucity of information regarding what the downstream effects of these strategies are. And so I'd like to open the discussion to comments from our 2 experts, Bill McGuire and Brenda Poindexter, as well as fielding some of your chat questions. I'd like to hear from our experts about where this evidence leads us. Can we define best practices regarding fortification or supplementation, or is the evidence too sparse? And what future research is urgently needed? So I turn that over to you now and welcome comments from our experts and from you in the audience. Thank you very much. This is the beginning of our flipped classroom, where I'm going to get an opportunity to ask you some questions, as well as hear from our experts, Bill McGuire and Brenda Poindexter. So I am privileged to have both Bill and Brenda online live with us now. We also have monitoring your chat my colleague Danielle Errett, who will both add her own comments, but as importantly, try to synthesize some of yours that come through the chat and get the input of our experts. Again, I'd like to thank our sponsors at Vermont Oxford Network and the Academy of Pediatrics, as well as the Gerber Foundation for helping support this series. And as a matter of disclosure, again, my roles at Vaughan and at Cochrane Neonatal, but no other relevant financial issues. So just to start things off, we do want to use the polling features and the chat features. Do type your questions into Danielle in the chat. She'll be monitoring it. I get too distracted, and she'll keep us honest and try to make sure that your voice is heard and your questions get answered. So let's just see if you've got this straight. There we go. Thank you for starting your polling. Of course, I only have the percentages. I see a result of 14. This is the percentages look more impressive than the sample size so far. I'm, of course, very happy to see some people joining us for the first time, but I see a lot of names in the participants and recognize many of you are faithful followers. And for those of you that don't remember, hopefully this will be a more memorable session. Let's close out the poll, Andy, and hopefully people are getting set up to do that, to answer the rest of our poll questions. Thanks. So I started the recorded session with the obvious statement that we all aim towards optimizing growth and believe that the standard for that should be the same as what fetal growth would look like. So let me ask just a poll everywhere question. What do you think average weight gain is during the 3rd trimester? Yeah, we'll wait for a second here, but I think you'll see that the vast majority, let's close that poll out, think that it's around 25 grams a day. And that is in fact true. Just looking at, there are any number of parameters that have been published. This is from the World Health Organization. And you can see here that fetal weight gain is around 25 to 26 grams per day during the third trimester. Now, I express this weight gain as just grams per day. Let me ask you, not so much in utero, but postnatally, what do you think um, the issue is in terms of postnatal growth failure? What percentage of VLBW infants experience postnatal growth failure uh, in our NICUs? And so most of you, it seems, are aware that it's really quite extreme. So in fact, it is. It's close to a third of infants. And although there's a fair amount of variation, in a quarter of our units, more than 40% of these infants experience severe or extreme growth failure. So that's pretty significant stuff. Let's go on, though, to the next parameter, because I don't think that you can look at the results of the studies without understanding what our expectations are for growth velocity postnatally, recognizing that that's compromised by being in intensive care. But on average, what do you think we currently achieve in terms of growth velocity? And here I see that there's a fair variation in people's expectations. Um, with most of you thinking that it's above 18 grams per kilo per day. Now, remember, we're asking about growth velocity here, not just weight gain per day. We all walk around on rounds talking about, oh, we're looking for 10 to 40 grams per, every day. But in fact, now we're talking growth velocity. And the answer there is that currently what we achieve is around 12 grams per kilo per day. This is some work looking at infants from Vermont to Oxford in 2000 to 2013, so a little dated, but even so, there are improvements that we've seen in that time. But really, we're only achieving 12 to 13 grams per kilo per day. And I think that's important when we look at the results of the studies to understand how meaningful they are. The next poll question I have for you is whether or not it matters. Are you impressed that improved growth velocity matters in terms of important downstream outcomes like development and growth? And here I think we see that most of us do accept the fact that the babies that we can get to grow better will have better important clinical outcomes. It's a hard literature to look at because clearly the sickest infants grow the worst. But I think that the underpinnings there are that we believe that improving nutrition will improve development. And many, many studies have reported this. This is just an example from Rich Aaronkrantz around growth in the NICHD network, suggesting that there are meaningful changes in developmental scores in these infants based on whether or not they're in the lower or higher quartiles for growth. All right, so let's really discuss this flip about where do we go and what do we actually do based on this information. So the first poll question I'd like to ask you is whether or not your center has specific written guidelines regarding fortification of feeds in very low birth weight infants. And I ask this in a very global sense. So most of us do have some sort of guideline. That's not to say what is in the guideline, but I think that's the first take home point for whatever few number of centers don't have such guidelines. Trying to get from this evidence your best practice will be very meaningful and a worthwhile exercise. We do know, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, that there is great variation of these practices. And really, we should try to come up with some standardization of practice. So now I'm going to ask some questions, and I'm going to be asking our experts to weigh in on some of your responses as well. And the first question is, do current trials in general demonstrate increases in growth velocity in infants who are fed more protein? Again, most of you did get the take-home point that there were changes in growth velocity. Here is just a summary slide from the various approaches that were taken, showing average increases from 0.66 grams per kilo per day to as high as 2.36 grams per kilo per day. But I'd like to turn this over to the experts for their comments. Are these clinically meaningful results? What do you take home from these studies?
Sure, Roger, I'll try to tackle that. And I'll start out by saying what a privilege it is just to be here today and be part of this great webinar. I think that when we talk about any kind of growth velocity, whether it's weight, length, or head circumference, it really depends on the baby and where they started out on. So, you could have a baby that starts at the 50th percentile and they could be gaining 18 grams per kilo per day and still now be tracking along the 5th percentile. Or you could have a baby that's gaining 12 grams per kilo per day, and if they're staying on their centile that they started at the time of birth, that may be perfectly reasonable for that baby. So um, I think it's really important to not simply focus on, the grams per kilo per day, but to really be looking at those trajectories over time, of not only weight, but also length gain. And I think that when I look back at some of the previous studies, even the way that weight gain velocity is calculated sometimes goes back to the birth weight and really doesn't take into account that contraction of the extracellular water and weight loss that we expect in our tiny babies over the first, week of life. And so I would just say that, really you have to look at the percentile that the baby's on and whether they're crossing centiles with time.
So the importance of following the growth chart as opposed to any single number, which is, I mean, velocity tries to get at some of that,
Right.
but it changes. It depends where you're starting on that curve, and even for the same baby, that expectation will change. Do you ever do you discuss the specific numerical grams per kilo per day growth changes, or do you simply use the plots on the various weight charts to track that?
I try to look at both. I think that, the when we crunch the numbers, we like to report that in rounds on at least a weekly basis to look at the average. But to be able to look at that without opening up the growth curve and making a comment on the centiles, and I think especially looking at the proportionality of the growth and making sure that a baby who's doing fine with weight but is starting to show faltering of their linear growth, that causes me, great concern.
Bill, any comments to share?
I think so the question about is this clinically meaningful, is it important for infants and for families? It's hard to tell. The striking thing about this slide is for such a common intervention, we've got such a paucity of reliable data. Infants who participated in trials in total there don't amount to more than a couple of thousand for something that we, as Brenda says, think about every day on rounds. Clinically meaningful weight gains or added mean differences of a couple of grams per kilo per day, probably not really. When you think about a 28-weeker 1 kilogram baby, give some fortifier for 4 to 6 weeks, you're adding about 70, 80 grams to that baby by the time they get to the sort of 33, 34 week stage when you're maybe thinking, let's stop the fortifier. So you're not making a big difference to that baby's time to get home, for example, if you have a weight criterion for discharge home. I suspect you're also not making very much difference at all to long-term growth, because it's post-discharge that these babies accelerate and refine their centile when they're home and we're not restricting the amount of milk they can drink the way we do. Or I don't think it'll make much difference to development, really. I mean, lots of the data suggesting that slow growth, and I prefer the term slow growth rather than growth failure or poor growth. So lots of the data suggesting that slow growth correlates with poor neurodevelopmental outcomes is really, as you said, Roger, completely confounded by sickness. And most of the variance in rates of growth and growth velocity in very preterm, and particularly extremely preterm infants, is explained not by the total nutrient content of their feeds or their parenteral feeds even, but by the number of times they've had feed interruptions because of intolerance or necrotizing enterocolitis or sepsis or some respiratory problem that's caused this to pause feeding. So most variance in growth outcomes in this population is really to do with us stopping giving them anything rather than, you know, the multi-nutrient fortifiers increase the energy content by 10 to 20%, increase the protein by a bit more, and therefore you get a 10 to 20% slightly higher rate of growth. But that doesn't have the big impact on the extremely preterm infant who's had a series of pauses because of suspected NEC or sepsis. So we tinker about an awful lot, and that includes individualized fortification. It includes worrying about whether the fortifier should be human or bovine in origin. But it's not the thing that makes the difference to the baby's longer term important outcomes, in my view.
Oh, good points. I'm particularly struck by your point about the paucity, the few infants, for a practice that we are constantly engaged with. Every day we spend a significant proportion of our time and decision making is around these issues of optimizing feeding, and the shocking paucity of data in terms of the numbers of infants, I think, is well worth noting. So let's ask that question about whether you fortify mother's own milk or donor breast milk with either a human milk-derived fortifier, a bovine milk-derived fortifier, or whether you use both depending on what your criteria or guidelines are. So it seems like close to 80%, I'm sorry, I was reading that wrong. There we go. That's changing radically. Half of you have the ability to give a human-derived fortifier and half do not, which I think is interesting right there on the face of it. So I think you saw, just to repeat the data, there is talk about a paucity of data for something that so many of us have embraced. Brenda and Bill, any comments about this practice?
Well, I'll kick off this time, Brenda. I'm really surprised that the poll suggests, and I'm guessing that this is mostly North American practice, that about 50% of participants have access to the human milk-derived fortifier. I certainly don't think that's the case in the UK at all, or in Europe, really. It's very expensive, and I've yet to see any evidence at all that has any advantage over bovine fortifier. So that's a big surprise to me. I'd be interested in Brenda's thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is clearly an area where we need additional studies, and we need a true head-to-head comparison with an exclusive human milk-based diet, and then where you could really compare the bovine to the human milk-derived fortifier. We just do not have, you know, that data. So I think that's an urgent need. You know, the other point that I would make, even before the discussion of, you know, what type of fortifier, is that most of our units were using the same strategy to fortify milk in terms of the timing and how much fortifier we're adding, and we're not really making that different based on whether the baby is predominantly receiving donor milk or preterm maternal milk. And I think has been pointed out, the macronutrient composition of donor milk is so vastly different from preterm maternal milk that I really question if the recipe, the timing, everything about the process of fortification, I would argue needs to take into account the base composition of the baby's diet. And, that's an area that I have really not seen very much in the way of studies to date.
So it is interesting. And Bill, your comment about we're privileged to have an international audience who dials into this seminar. And I have no doubt that several different continents are shocked by each other's practice on this. That 50%, I'm pretty confident, is us here in the US. And the rest of the world taking a more skeptical view based on the paucity of evidence and the expenses. Here in the US, there's this whole sort of pseudo-Bayesian idea that it makes sense. It's mom's protein. It's not cow's protein. And damn the expenses. We will grasp at even minimal evidence to move forward. It may or may not turn out to be a reasonable practice, but certainly there's a paucity of evidence to support it. So let's ask this somewhat unique question. One of the series of analyses looked at this whole idea of how we individualize nutritional care. And that could be either the adjusted or targeted diet fortification, adjusted based on the infant's needs and targeted based on the composition of the breast milk. Either way, the vast majority of us don't take such an approach. And I'd like to turn that over to our experts to make some comments.
Yeah, I mean, until recently, there was not a device for clinical use that was approved, at least in the US, by the FDA. I think that it's been an important research tool to look at individual milk analysis. I think there was a wonderful study out of Canada that showed that if you analyzed milk, it required adjusting one of the components of the milk up to every 12 hours to be able to actually meet the intended, nutrient composition. And I think that the expense and the labor intensity of that kind of approach, my personal opinion is that effort could be, spent better by supporting the moms in our NICUs in continuing lactation. And I think if we just think about, especially when we're using donor milk or when we have a baby who is, not growing well, I think just adding additional fortification without the labor intensity of trying to individualize it, to me makes more sense, because these devices are expensive and, really would require, I think, more manpower than most units have. And again, I would like to see, those resources be used to supporting moms in lactation.
Bill, any thoughts in terms of this? This tends to be a European approach.
No, I think I agree 100% with Brenda there. I mean, I think we've always individualized fortification and more broadly nutrient input. We've looked at the baby's growth patterns, as we've discussed. We've looked at some metabolic measures, as we've discussed. We've been aware that donor breast milk has lower content of energy and protein than the expressed breast milk from a mum who's expressing every 3 hours, therefore increasing her protein content. We've always done that. I watch those babies, give the babies more milk, and then sometimes fortify it, and sometimes add another sachet. I don't measure it, but I just think, this baby probably can do with a bit more, so you put 2 sachets in instead of 1, and you do that occasionally. So we do individualize things. And I think that's right. You know, rounds in the morning should consider these aspects of nutrition, but I haven't been aware of anyone particularly providing really strong evidence, and certainly that's borne out with this review, that these sort of more targeted approaches where you measure the bedside measurement of fat content, for instance, I've not really been convinced that that's the way to go beyond what we already do.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair point. What we already do is a black box approach. We see whether we're meeting the needs based on various growth parameters, et cetera. So it's not like we take a blind eye towards the individual baby's needs. We just don't sort of make it as technical. Danielle, I know I haven't gotten to the chat. I failed miserably. I'm looking
That's
at it
okay.
out
I
of the
was just
corner of
going to
my
sneak
eye.
in.
Anything to bring up from our
Yes, there's been a number of excellent questions, some of which you've already covered over the course of this discussion. But quickly in thinking about the parameters, there were a number of great questions about Z-scores, and maybe some comments from our discussants about the utility of using that as a metric.
I tend to think of those as research tools. We're looking at population, and we're trialing a different intervention, a different nutritional intervention, for example. Then clearly looking at the average of the population, and the Z-score sorts out variation there for us. I don't use it at all for the individual baby in the unit. Brenda?
Yeah, I would just go back to my earlier comment that I really try to compare each baby, against their own sort of trajectory, and in a way looking, at their own change over time, and getting concerned if they have had a dramatic decline in their percentile.
So again, I apologize, Danielle. I have an eye to the chat. It's vibrant and interesting, and I hope people do read it as we go along, but I haven't gotten to you enough. But I am going to need to tie things up as we come to an end, and I'd like to ask the experts to each take 2 minutes to make their point about synthesis. What practices do you feel we should focus on that truly optimize nutrition? And I guess the next slide, and you can address it in this, what in fact are the research issues that we need to address? If I could throw it to each of you, point counterpoint for 2 minutes, and then we'll wrap up.
I think my summary would be that prevention is going to be the best strategy. And so sort of being mindful of what do those early phases of weight loss, what should we expect? And then, being mindful that transition between weaning parenteral nutrition and advancing enteral is a time where we have to really focus on overall intake to try to, limit the amount of really suboptimal intake and weight and linear growth loss during those vulnerable times. I would say, focusing efforts on provision of maternal milk and only using donor milk, as a bridge is probably one of the best investments, that we can make. And then, really just encouraging people to, resist the urge to say, well, we already know how to do this. And we really need to support rigorous, well-designed studies that really, do contribute to more outcomes longer term, when it comes to nutritional interventions.
And Bill, the almost last word.
Well, I agree. Human milk is the key. Maybe trials looking at new strategies to support mums. We still have a positive data on galactologs, for instance, the role there. The unit environment, the role of skin care and kangaroo mother care. We have done, I was complaining about the positive data, but we have done successful trials now in rates of feeding and feed advancement. I think there's still a bit of a gap in our knowledge in post-discharge nutritional support for premies going home weighing 2 kilograms, and how we can really optimize that post-discharge phase of catch-up growth. So I think there's need for trials there as well.
Both of you brought out the point, as well as I see on the chat, that the issue of supporting the other, and on so many levels, clearly is the biggest bang for our buck. And the pretense that we're going to add a little something on top of it probably is not the most critical issue. But obviously, the trials data, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. But I'll close this out. I'll thank Brenda and Bill and Danielle for joining us. I always enjoy these sessions, particularly this flipped discussion, and look forward to meeting you all again in 2021 to pursue more issues around the evidence behind current guidelines in neonatal care. And I'm getting very sentimental in the midst of all of this COVID issues. And I really want to wish that you all stay safe, enjoy the holidays, and look forward for better days. Colleen, do you want to just jump in and tell people how they can get their CME for this? It's up here on the slide, but anything else they should know?
No, we'll send out a post-webinar link to everyone who registered beforehand. So if you're attending and you didn't register beforehand, be sure to reach out. But otherwise, all the registered attendees will receive the links to complete the surveys in order to get your CMEs and nursing credit units. Thank you all very much.
Yep. Thank you all. And again, thanks to our discussants, Brenda, Bill, and Danielle. And thanks to all of you, and look forward to seeing you all in the next year, either remotely or someday soon in person, I hope. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.